Hey, Shalom, and welcome to Wisdom in Torah Ministries. I'm also always happy to be back and share with you some of the stuff that I'm learning. In my research in the last few weeks, I have been going over a lot of the steps and essence of the temple. I've been looking into the Temple Mount. I've been going over a lot of the commandments of the temple. And I find myself revisiting a particular topic that as I listen to other people talk about it and the temple, it always seems to cause a little bit of a confusion. And what I'm going to do, I want to just guide you through some of the evidence. It's like I always tell you, do not believe anything I say, verify everything I say. So today we're going to study this together, okay? And the question is, what is the middle wall of division? You know, let me put it out here so you see it. The middle wall of division. That's always been a very controversial topic, because within the church system and the system of religion, there's still a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. That's not true everywhere. That's not true with every denomination. But remember, as we come into the understanding of the Torah, we're still trying to figure out certain principles, and sadly, sometimes we're still holding on to some of the things we learned in the past. So what I want to do, I want to be able to share with you some contextual principles using a temple app that I have, okay, and also all the verses and the evidence. So I'm going to quote you from Ephesians, Acts, the book of Exodus, Ezekiel, the book of Maccabees and Josephus, and I want to show you whether or not Ephesians chapters 2, verse 11 and verse 15 or verse 16 is talking about the Soreg. Now, what is the Soreg? The Soreg, it was a fence that was put around the temple, right, that would limit the access for people to go beyond a point because of the levels of purity. That's really the reason. Now, I got to be honest with you. Back in the day, I also used to teach that it was something that would separate the nations from God. I made that mistake. That was back about 16 years ago when I was starting out. I was still trying to look at some of the wrong resources that I was looking into, and I was making a mistake in trying to interpret it my own way. And I was wrong. I going into the proper understanding of the levels of holiness, I finally figured out, according to the Torah, that that fence has always been there all along. That's not an invention of the rabbis or the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's basically, it's always been there. It had to do with the levels of sanctity. In the temple, you deal with sanctity and purity. There are different levels. The sanctity and the levels of holiness for a priest is greater than one of the Levites, and the Levites greater than an Israelite, and an Israelite greater than the nations. So when you go into Jerusalem, let's say in the Mishnah, in the Kehati Mishnah, the Tractate Kelim, you're going to have about the 10 degrees of holiness. The 10 degrees of holiness. So you have the whole world. God created the whole earth. But Israel is holier than the rest of the nations. Then you have Israel is holier than the rest of the nations. Then Jerusalem is holier than the rest of Israel. And then the city of Jerusalem is holier than the rest of Jerusalem and, the Israel. The Temple Mount is holier than the city and Israel and the nations. And then you have the court of the women is holier than the Temple Mount, the rest of the Temple Mount, the city, Israel, and the nations, and so on and so forth. Then you have the court of Israel, the court of the Levites, or not the Levites, but the Dukan, where the Levites will stand. And then you have the Azara, which is the priestly courtyard, which is holier than everything else. And then you have the holy place that only certain priests can go in during the day. And then you have the Holy of Holies, which is the holiest place of all. So as you can see, it's ascending to the Lord. So the question is, where did this order begin? Is that something that was established by some rabbi in the Middle Ages or some rabbis in the first century or even the Jews in Babylon? That's what we're here to find out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you some slides, but I'm going to give you some verses as we go along with it, okay? But I want to read you the verses, then I want to quote you the slides. So let's go to Ephesians chapters 2, verse 14, which is actually the verse that everyone quotes in regards to this. This is what's bringing all of the confusion. So let's go there real quickly, okay? All right, so it reads, Ephesians chapters 2, verse 11 says, So then, remember that at one time you, Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcision by those who are called the circumcision, a physical circumcision made in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenant of promise. Remember, here it's not talking about temple purity. It's talking to the Ephesians. It's talking about something completely different than temple purity. Okay? They're in Ephesus. They're not in Jerusalem. Keep that in mind. Location is important. All right, let's continue. And it says, But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. For he is our peace. Now pay attention. It says, in his flesh, he has made us both groups into one and broken down the dividing wall. That is, the hostility between us. Well, what is the hostility between the Gentiles and the Jews in the first century? Was it the temple? That was never a hostility to a Gentile because they can never have access to the temple. So surely, what is it talking about? I submit to you that it's speaking about the laws of Shammai and Hillel, specifically the 18 edicts of Shammai, in which Shammai have established the 18 edicts when he was the president of the Sanhedrin Council, or the vice president of the Sanhedrin Council, and they actually established certain decrees or laws because he was the leader of the Sanhedrin Council. He interpreted certain laws and made distinction between the Jewish people and the nations. And we know later on, after Yeshua died and resurrected, that Gamaliel and the rest of the Sanhedrin from that moment on began to reverse some of his decisions that was creating a division. So Shammai basically made it impossible for a Gentile to be able to come in. They could, but they have to go through a lot of issues, and that was a middle wall of division, theology. In other words, there was a caste system of Rome. And in the caste system of Rome, you combine that with the hate for the Jewish people. And within the Jewish people and the systems of the Judeans in Israel, you have the class of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the different groups. Plus, on top of that, you have the laws of Shammai, the rulings of Shammai in this case, the rulings of Shammai, and that created a wedge. We see that in Acts chapters 15, verse 1 through 6. We see that in Galatians chapters 2, when verse 11, when Paul is correcting Peter because Peter would not eat with the Gentiles, that in this case, they were already serving, following Torah, serving Messiah. So there was a theological mindset. There was something going on that was not a command of God. Okay, but that does not exclude the rules of the temple. Remember, the location, the geographical location of the words of Paul here are to the Ephesians in Ephesus. The Jews in Asia Minor would never accept the Gentiles, even if they converted. They always treated them separately because they come from Gentile backgrounds. So they're going to feel like there's going to be a separation. The rulings of Shammai actually made it a little bit more difficult. And now we have Paul trying to share with a huge amount of people from the nations who are embracing the Torah through Yeshua, the Messiah, but then the edicts of Shammai are coming against them, that dogma. That's what it says right here. I'm going to show it to you. It says, he has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances. If you look at that word ordinances right here, and if you look at the bottom, let me make it a little bigger so you can see what I mean. If I go right here, whoops, give me a second. Ordinances, and I say study, the Greek word that appears is dogma. Okay? Dogma. Now, the Lord has always wanted for all the nations to come to him. We know that. The temple was always for all nations to come and pray. But one thing that we need to understand is that The fact that God desires for all the nations to go to his mountain, the mountain of the Lord, which is where the temple stood, does that mean that temple purity and the levels of purity are not important? You see, someone with the corpse impurity, who was unclean by touching a dead person, a woman in her menstrual cycle, these are Israelites, by the way, a priest or a Levite who had a seminal discharge, or a Gentile who's not circumcised, cannot go in certain areas of the temple, because it's about purity, it's about life. So therefore, the levels of purity in the temple, it's not only excluding a Gentile, he's excluded for different reasons, because he doesn't have the circumcision, which is the sign to be in the covenantal relationship with God and Israel. But a priest is in covenant, he's circumcised. A Levite is in covenant, he's circumcised. An Israelite is in covenant, he's circumcised. And the woman, although she's not circumcised clearly, but she is an Israelite, she's a Jewish woman or an Israelite, but she cannot go into the temple. If she gave birth, she was excluded to go into the temple for a certain amount of days, 40 days for a male and 60 for a female, for a baby, boy or girl. A man with a seminal discharge or someone in leprosy could not be inside the city. So this is not to exclude anybody. This is only to teach Israel what is holy according to the principles of God. God is trying to say, you're going to approach me. There are levels of sanctity. There are levels of purity. There's a protocol that you must follow in order to come see me. And that's what that fence was there for. The fence that we're referring to, I'm going to show it to you so you see what I mean, is from, I'll show you from the app that we have. Hopefully I'll give you an idea. I'm looking from the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. I'm looking towards the northeastern corner, and normally you see the outer fence. So if I move over here, check this out. If I move here, you see this fence around the bottom, follow my arrow. If you follow this big old wall, this was the extending wall that Herod built. I'm looking west now, and now be looking south where those scrolls are on the bottom. I'm looking now towards the southeast. That's the royal store. And that's that wall that you see right in front of you, right here, is the 500 by 500 wall around the temple. Okay? Now, inside that wall, you're going to see a small fence with some openings. That is called the Soreg. And we're going to walk there in a minute. But I want you to notice that these walls that you see served as levels to teach you about levels of sanctity. That big wall right here in front of you that you see with the arrow, these are the Hurda gates on the south. And these walls were the original 500 by 500 measurement of the temple. 500 cubits by 500 cubits. And later on, all that you see here from this wall to the south, where that building is, all the way to the wall, was added by Herod. And if I go here to looking north now, this wall here that you see the mouse, to the left, to this big wall, was added by Herod as an extending to the west. Okay? So the wall that you see in front of me would have been the original 500 by 500 at the time of Solomon. And then, Second Temple period. Okay? The Hasmonean later on added to the south. But what we're looking at is Second Temple period. Now, inside that wall that you see in front of me, okay, you're going to see that little fence over here all around the temple. So let me take you down there so you see what I mean. As I'm walking through, I'm going to take you through that door. I'm walking now to the to the east, northeast, and I'm going to go through one of the gates. Now, this is an important thing that you see, because sadly, is being taught right now that the temple protocol, or the rabbis, or the Pharisees, or the Sadducees, which is not true, were actually making a distinction between Gentiles and Jews, and that they were the one who put this fence that you see in front of you. Now, why is this fence significant? This is the Soreg. Now I'm going to we're looking north now. We're going to start looking east right here. And this fence went all around the temple proper. Now, Gentiles could stand where I'm standing. This is a huge plaza that they can stand in here or on the other side of the wall. But they were not allowed to go beyond this point. And I'm going to give you some examples. As you see right in front of you, that's the message of the Soreg, where it says that by death of penalty, anyone from the nations, a foreigner, cannot cross through this fence. Why? Because God is a racist and he doesn't want people from the nations, or that the Jews are racist or the Levites are racist? No. Because of the laws of sanctity, the laws of holiness. You see, when we don't study the temple proper, we miss these details. And then we assume that there's a hidden agenda by putting a fence there. Let me give you some examples, biblical examples, how that fence has always been there. Okay? All right, so let's go to this other map that I want to show you. Looking from the southeast to the northwest. Okay, the bottom of the screen will be southeast. And you see the 500 by 500. You see where the court of the Gentiles is right here. Unmeasured, unprotected. In other words, there was that fence. Remember that fence I showed you? It will be right around here. 500 by 500. Now, this one inside, right in here, is the Soreg. That will separate the nations from Israel, because beyond that point, or beyond this point right here now, if you're walking through, now you're in a higher level of sanctity, of holiness. Now we see an example of this in the book of Acts. Let's go to the book of Acts. I want to show you how this was practiced in the temple. In the book of Acts, chapters 21, in verse 11, verse 27, says this: when 7 days were almost completed, Jews from Asia have seen him in the temple. It's talking about Paul. Remember, Paul just did a Nazirite vow. He just did a Nazirite vow. He's completing the Nazirite vow. And then he's going right into the temple. And they accused him of bringing one from Ephesus, actually, Trophimus, who was a Gentile, into the temple. He was accused. And he was arrested. And you're going to see the temple protocol here. All right? Now, it says this: they seized him shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place," the temple. Notice, they accused Paul of teaching against the people of Israel, the Torah, and the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, HaMakom, the place. More than that, he has actually brought Greek into the temple and has defiled this holy place. Notice that it's not saying, they're Gentiles, we hate them, they cannot be here. The language that it's using is, it has defiled this place because of the levels of sanctity. That's the only way we can look at this, because that's the reason why he got arrested, because the accusation was that they already put a sign there, as you saw. If you go back to the sign, I'm going to take you back to the screen, and you go right in there, and you're going to see the sign. We put it in the app, so you'll be informed about that. See the sign, so anyone going through there, and everyone in the ancient world understood this, by the way. It's us in the Western world, we don't get it. As I was studying ancient Near Eastern history, everyone understood about sacred spaces, the realm of the gods. And people they were very respectful of ancient temples and the realm of the gods in the ancient world. How come we don't know this? Because we are not surrounded by that. Okay? So in this case, someone who's not in covenant, who bears the sign of circumcision, cannot do this, cannot go right through here. The moment you step here, now the penalty was death according to the way that it was prescribed. And why is that? Why was the penalty so severe? Because you are encroaching in God's holiness. So let me finish these verses, in the book of Acts, and then I'm going to show you where this is established on Mount Sinai. And we're going to let the evidence stand on itself, okay? All right. So, let's go back to the reading. Verse 29 it says, "For they have previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together." Now, the next verses are very important, guys. It says, "They seized Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut." And that's very important, because that means that the doors were shut because there was being an encroachment, transgression of holiness in this case. All right? Now, let me take you to Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus chapters 19. Let's see if these levels of holiness were established by God himself. Okay, when you go to Exodus chapters 19, verse 12 and 13, I'm going to read from verse 11 for better context. It says, "When Moses had told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, 'Go to the people and consecrate them.'" Notice the language. "Consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes." That's why you do a mikvah before you go to the temple, because the temple is considered the mountain of the Lord, just like Mount Sinai was the mountain of the Lord. "Be careful not to go up the mountain or touch the edge of it. Let me read verse 11. "And prepare for the third day, because on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai on the sight of all the people. You shall set limits." This is the reason why the Soreg was established. Right here. It's actually in the Bible. "You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, 'Be careful not to go up the mountain or touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death.' So therefore, when you go to the temple and you go beyond the area where you're allowed to go into, if you touch it according to the command, you are to be put to death." So this is not something that any rabbi invented. This is taken directly from Exodus 19. Because the whole area, and I'm going to show you another picture so you see what I mean. The same division that you see in the temple, you see in Mount Sinai. You see the top of the mountain, that's the most holy area that only Moses could go into as the Holy of Holies if you connect it with the tabernacle on the right. Then you have the middle of the mountain. That is exactly where the children, the sons of the 70 elders, that's the equivalent of the Sanhedrin Council, and Joshua went to, and they could not go up beyond a point. They were here in this area. It's interesting. And then you see beyond the bottom line, they set perimeters around the mountain. Only the holy people can be around the mountain. Now, people will say, "Well, Rico, there were Gentiles or there were strangers that were mixed multitude that were on Mount Sinai." Yes, but they were all holy, because Joshua, chapters 5, gives us a very interesting piece of information that we must consider in this context. When you read Joshua chapters 5, verse 2 forward, it says, "At the time the Lord said to Joshua, 'Make the flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel,'" again, the second time. We're talking about the second generation. But what does the Bible say about the first generation that came out of Egypt? Watch. It says, "So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the heel of the foreskin." Verse 4. "And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All of the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all of the men of war, have died in the wilderness on the way after they have come to Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised." So when they were in Mount Sinai, everyone was circumcised. In the events of chapters 19 of the book of Exodus, the whole congregation was holy. They already bathed themselves for 3 days. They presented themselves before the Lord. That means that they are a holy convocation, and they are in sacred grounds. Okay? I will guarantee you that that second generation that were not circumcised could not go near the tabernacle the times they were in the wilderness. Okay, remember that. This is important because the Bible specifically tells us that the circumcision was a requirement in order to go into the temple. That is a fact. Okay, so how do we know this? Okay, if we go to Ezekiel chapters 44, let's go to Ezekiel chapters 44 so we can read it for ourselves. In Ezekiel chapters 44, verses 4 all the way to verse 9. Listen to what it says. It says, admission to the temple. Again, we already established, ladies and gentlemen, that the limits of holiness were established by God himself when the Lord talked to Moses. He told him, do not even touch it. Don't go beyond the threshold. So the Soreg is the threshold around the temple, because the Temple Mount and the temple is the holy mountain. That's where the presence of God was. So whoever you hear saying that it was an invention of the rabbis or the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're not really studying the temple. Okay? They need to understand the laws of holiness. This is important. Okay? So listen to what it says. Let's read it together. Then he brought me by the way of the north gate to the front of the temple, and I looked, and lo, the glory of the Lord filled the temple of the Lord, and I fell upon my face. The Lord said to me, mortal, mark well, look closely, and listen attentively to all that I shall tell you concerning all the ordinances of the temple of the Lord and all its laws. And mark well those who may be admitted to a temple, to the temple, and all those who are to be excluded from the temple. There we go. Again, we have the establishment of holiness is done by God, not the rabbis or the Sadducees. They follow the purity laws of the temple. But the limits of what is permissible and what is not in the temple were established by the Lord himself. Okay? And this is something we need to understand. The rabbis to this day cannot change anything. They have to use a precedent, a biblical precedent, to establish anything. Okay, I'm not defending them. I'm just letting you know how it works. Okay, because they cannot change the law. So going back to this topic, let's read that verse again because I want to show you something very important. The establishment of purity is done by God. It says, the Lord said to me, mortal, mark well, look closely, and listen attentively to all that I shall tell you concerning all the ordinances of the temple of the Lord and all its laws. And mark well those who may be admitted to the temple and those who are to be excluded from the sanctuary. Say to the rebellious house, the house of Israel. It's interesting that those who are saying this about the Soreg are the house of Israel. Doesn't surprise me. The Lord speaking to us, even in prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. Thus says the Lord Elohim, O house of Israel, let there be an end to all your abominations. In admitting foreigners, uncircumcised in heart and flesh, to be in my sanctuary, profaning my temple. Notice, profaning my temple. It deals with purity. Okay? Halal. Halal is the word. Pierce. Defiled. Profane. Okay? And it says to profane my temple. When you offer my food, the fat and the blood, you have broken the covenant with all your abominations, and you have not kept the charge of my sacred things, or my sacred offerings, I'm sorry. But you have appointed foreigners to act for you in keeping my charge in my sanctuary. Thus says the Lord God, no foreigner, uncircumcised in heart and flesh, of all the foreigners who are among the people of Israel shall enter my sanctuary. I think it's quite clear. So as you can see here, the levels of holiness and the perimeters of where you can go and how far you can go is not established by me or any religious group. Is preserved, the purity of the location is preserved by the priests and the Levites. That's why you have 24 priestly court, the Levitical guard, to protect them from anyone coming into a higher level of holiness. So if you're uncircumcised, even if you love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and you're making conversion in the first century, but if you're not circumcised, you will know not to go beyond that area. And they will teach you, if you're not circumcised, we're not going to reject you from enjoying Jerusalem, but beyond this point, you cannot go beyond, farther. Let me give you an example how this works. In your homes, you have the same perimeters. If you own a piece of land, you have a fence. If somebody comes through your fence unannounced, without being invited, well, it's called trespassing, right? You have the right to defend yourself if your life is in danger. Now, if that person comes in through your fence, and you gave him permission to come through your fence, now they could only go so far into your front door. You choose to open the door, now he's welcome to come into your living room. He gets to sit and be in the common area. You give him, he's your guest. So you let him be in your living room. He can go to the bathroom that you make accessible to him. But let's say he becomes a guest. Now that guest came through your fence, through your gate, came through your threshold. Now you assigned that person access to your house because you know them. You have intimacy in the sense of friendship. And now you assign a room. Now that room, the moment you give that room to that person, that is his sacred space. He has free reign in that room, and you give him a bathroom. That is his room and his bathroom, even though it's your house, because you assigned it to him. If you want, you as the owner of the home, you want to go get something in that room out of respect for his sacred space, for his space, you knock on the door, say, hey, can I grab something? Of course, it's your house. But you gave him the respect to knock on the door and to ask permission to go in there because you assigned it to him. Let me ask you all a question. How would you feel if the person that you gave access to your house by grace, let him enjoy the blessing of having a room so he can rest and sleep? Now that person abuses your sacred space by walking freely and roaming through your house, and then you find that person's laying down in your marriage bed. There's no one in it, just him. You go into your house and you find that person who you gave him only access to that room, all of a sudden now is roaming your house, is going into restricted areas, your sacred space, which is your bathroom, which is your bedroom, where you and your wife sleep. How would you feel? Wouldn't that be a transgression of your sacred space? Wouldn't you be offended that this person just took it upon themselves to transgress your sacred spaces? That's exactly how the Lord establishes his house. He tells them, I want all the nations to come see me. But if you're not committed to my covenant, you cannot go beyond a threshold. Only those who bear my sign of circumcision can go beyond a threshold. In other words, it can go here. Let me take you there so you see what I mean. Let me move back a little bit so I can make the example. So a Gentile will have free reign to go all through here. They can see the buildings from afar. They can walk all the way to the east. They can enjoy the beauty of the house from afar. But they cannot go beyond that point. But let's say that Gentile now says, I want to go in there. What do I need to do? Well, you need to be in covenant with the God who dwells in that house. Well, how do I do it? Well, I love him by keeping his commandments. What are his commandments? The Torah. Well, how would I start a relationship? They're not going to tell you, you need to get circumcised right away. They're going to tell you the most basic principles of holiness. Abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. Abstain from adultery. Abstain from fornication. Abstain from idolatry. And then read the Torah. Eventually, as you study, you're going to recognize that you want to be committed. I know the character of this God. I understand my commitment. I know that he's faithful. I know that he's true. And now the next step is, I'm going to get circumcised. You get circumcised now according to the Torah, because we already saw in the book of Ezekiel that no uncircumcised in the heart or uncircumcised in the flesh shall enter his sanctuary. And that's the millennial reign. So the Torah does not change. So let's go back to the book of Exodus, and let's find out if this holds true. In the book of Exodus, chapters 12, verse 47 to 49. It says, the whole congregation, and by the way, you see that word ordinance right here? Let's look that one up. Chukah. The word chukah is a statute. The word chukah is a rule. A chukah cannot be changed. It's a law. It's a define. It's law. It's ordinance. It's a practice. It's a custom. It's a right. It's a privilege. So therefore, the Lord says in the book of Exodus, chapters 12, verse 43, and this is not a popular message. People don't want to hear this. They want sloppy grace, and that's it. We want to get holier, and we want to go everywhere in the temple, but we do not want to respect God's sacred space. But if I go to your house and I start walking around your house freely without permission, you're not going to invite me back to your house. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinances, the chukah, for the Passover. It cannot be changed. No foreigner shall eat of it. For any slave, but any slave who have been purchased may eat of it after he has been circumcised. No bound or hire servant may eat of it. Why? Because it's sacred, holy, covenantal meal. It has been eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the animal outside the house. You shall not break any of its bones. The whole congregation of Israel shall celebrate it. If an alien who resides with you wants to celebrate the Passover of the Lord, all his males shall be circumcised, then he may draw near to celebrate it. That word draw near is a temple language. Okay? To draw near, to celebrate it. He shall be regarded as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the alien who resides among you. All the Israelites did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, that every day, that very day the Lord brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, company by company. In other words, we have a commandment that tells us, if you want to eat of this covenantal meal, notice, you cannot eat it outside your house. You know what happened in Jerusalem? When the Passover, according to Deuteronomy chapter 16, could not be eaten any other place but when the temple was standing, by the way. The Passover lamb, the Korban Pesach. If you eat meat now, if you eat a Passover, if you eat a lamb today in the Western world, whatever, you cannot call it the Passover lamb because it has to be offered in the temple. But in Jerusalem, when the temple was standing, the only place you can eat the Passover lamb was within the city walls of Jerusalem. Okay? Because the whole city is holy. Just like the house of the Israelites in Egypt were holy. That's a holy convocation, Passover. The meal is a holy meal. Only those in covenant can partake of it. And by the way, if you want to celebrate Passover and you go to the temple, guess what? You have to offer the lamb inside the temple. So you have to cross the threshold. So therefore, if a stranger, a foreigner, wants to celebrate it, the Lord says, I want your commitment to the covenant. Thus, now once you commit it, you can do this. You can come through here, no penalty, because now you're circumcised in your heart and you're circumcised in the flesh. Then you can go in all the way through that gate, and then you can partake of an offering of the Passover lamb in the Azara, in the area where you're supposed to take it to. It's not a problem if you're in covenant. Ladies and gentlemen, if we study the temple, we will see this. So for anyone who says that the Soreg was an invention of the rabbis, with all due respect to anyone who believes that, please reconsider that position, because it is not true. It's not going to hold on as evidence in anywhere. The Bible says otherwise, and we need to be accountable to what we read. Okay? Okay, so now I read you from Ezekiel 44. I read you from Exodus chapters 12. I read you from Exodus chapters 19. I read you from Ephesians 2, which has nothing to do with temple purity. It's not even talking about the temple. It's talking about the Ephesians in Ephesus. Let's go back there for a minute so we can find more context, okay? The issue is not the entry to the temple. The issue here is whether or not they will be accepted in the kingdom as equals. Chapters 2, Ephesians. If you keep reading, it says, but now in Messiah Yeshua, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Messiah, for he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the middle wall of division. That is, the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, dogma. Remember, we already established that the middle wall, or the Soreg, or the wall of division in the temple, this wall, the wall that I showed you here, let me show you again. Let me go right here. When I go to the Sanhedrin Council, I turn around. I'm turning around here. Let me take you. I want to take you out so you see, because I want to read these verses with you getting a picture of what I'm talking about, okay? It is important. That fence, I'm in the sanctified area. Beyond that fence, I'm looking south. Beyond that fence, the Gentiles can go only that far. Where I'm standing right now is a higher level of sanctity, a sanctified area, okay? Because of the levels of purity. All right, so when you go back to the book of Ephesians, it says, he has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he may create in himself a new humanity in place of the two, thus making peace. Now, did you know that where there is new, a new man, one new man? But I like what the translation, new humanity. It's not talking about the laws of the temple here. It's talking about, in reality, homos novus, one new man. Yeshua removed death. Death was against us. Death kept us from going into God's holiness, returning to the garden. It's a completely different topic here. Now, you have a dual problem. You have the caste system of Rome, who has different social status, slaves, freedmen, plebs, patricians, senators. That was a whole chaos in themselves there by status, honor, and shame. In Israel, you have what is called the different groups. You have the Sadducees, you have the Pharisees. And within the Pharisees, you have different types of Pharisees. And the leadership in the Pharisees, when they were leading the house of Shammai, they were imposing upon the people, separating certain rules to separate the nations from intermingle. Okay? Now the Lord wants to bring all the nations to Israel. He wants to bring all the nations to the mountain. He wants to bring all the nations to the holy areas. But He's holy. He cannot compromise His holiness. It's up to the people of Israel, in this case, the priests. I'm going to read it to you. Actually, let's read it together. I like to read stuff together so you can see it, okay? When you go back to Ezekiel, and I've read many times these verses already, people should know them by heart. I keep going back to it all the time because they're so significant. When you read Ezekiel 44, verses 23 and 24, it says this: they shall teach my people the difference between holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the clean and the unclean. The Soreg, this fence, the priest was supposed to teach you the difference between clean, where I'm at, and unclean on the other side of the fence. Holy, where I'm at, and unholy on the other side of the fence. You see what I mean? Because that's what the laws of holiness were, and the priests were in charge of doing this. God wants to be inclusive. He wants to include all the nations to come to the mountain. But they need to come with a covenantal heart. Circumcision of the heart and circumcision of the flesh, because he is the king and he establishes his rules of conduct, what is holy to him, what is acceptable to him, and we need to follow. Okay, so the last pieces of information, I'm almost done. So where do we find the Soreg in the Bible? I already showed you Exodus 19, where he established, let me read those again, okay? I got to read those again. So we're going to establish with Exodus 19. I know it takes longer, but I think it's great because of accountability, okay, guys? And I think this is important. It says the people consecrated. When you read verse 11, it says, verse 10, when Moses had told the words of the people, the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes. This is why you do a mikvah every time you went to the mountain, to the Temple Mount, to the temple. And prepare for the third day, because on the third day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set limits for the people all around. Now, who set the limits? Moses. Moses set the limits. They are the limits. Moses went to the most holy, the top of the mountain. The 70 elders went beyond that, a little lower in the middle of that mountain. And the people were at the bottom. And remember, he set threshold around the bottom of the mountain as a fence. And that's what the Soreg was for. That's the context. Be careful not to go up to the mountain or touch the edge of it. Any who touch the mountain shall be put to death. The edge of it. So guess what? The Soreg will become the equivalent of the edge of the mountain. Notice, I got to go up. You see that? So you go up in elevation. You're always making aliyah, always ascending. So this will be the equivalent of the edge of the mountain. It's all around the temple, and I don't have time to go all around. Let me show you something significant. If I go through that gate, I got to go up in elevation. Only the priest can go through, only the priest, Israel can be in here. I'm going to go right through this gate. Only the priest can be here in this area. This is called the exadra. Okay? Priests can go beyond this place. When you go into the platform, you're going up steps. You see how big it's higher. Another high level of elevation. Only the priests can walk in this area. This is south of the altar now. Only the priest can be here. Now, the area that you see coming up in these steps that we're going to be covering here pretty soon, the steps, I'm going to go down. Israel can come here. Now, the steps that you see there on the left, that's where the Levites will stand. The Levites can only go up to that point. They cannot go beyond that point. Now, the priests can be in the priestly area here. They have to be chosen to do the work. They have to be chosen to slaughter the animal. They were chosen to fillet it. They were chosen to do the service on the mizbeach, the altar. But then, to go beyond that veil, only some priests can be selected to make another aliyah, 12 steps, elevation. Only the chosen priests can go in here to do the incense. The Levites cannot come in here. A king of Israel cannot come in here. The king of Israel could only go as far as north of that altar. Let me show you where. Right here where that little scroll is, that's where he could go. The only he could go there and sit there, and that's it. A king of the land of David. He could not come inside the temple. There was a king of Israel, when he got very arrogant, he wanted to do the incense service, and he got thrown out of the temple by the priest, and he got leprosy because of it. And only this area can a priest chosen by lot can go in maybe twice a day. For the morning, shaharit, and for the afternoon, mincha, to do the incense and to do the to offer the incense and to clean the menorah. And once a week, the priest will come in and change the showbread here on the right. And only once a year, can one man come in this place between the veil, which is, now we're walking north. Let me go a little bit here. I'm going to go slowly because I want to take you in here. We're walking north. Whoops, sorry. Between the two veils that you find in the first and the second temple period. And then you will look west. And then only the high priest can come in here once a year, invited by God. Not an Israelite. Not a king of Israel. Not a Levite. Not even a priest can go in there unless he was a priest of the line of Aaron. There's a family of Aaron that can go in there. Okay? So as you can see, there were levels of holiness. The whole city was like that. So the Soreg, that wall that I've showed you the whole time, the whole foundation of this teaching, has nothing to do with separation of the nations from God. On the contrary, it's preserving the holiness of God and preserving the life of the person from the nations who wants to come up to serve the Lord but does not understand God, the gods of Israel's levels of holiness and what He requires. It's up to us to teach them. You want to go beyond that threshold? This is what it takes. It takes commitment to an oath, commitment, obedience. Once you know the conditions, a sign for the covenant. Once you take that sign of the covenant, now you can go in. Yeshua allows us to come into the kingdom, being grafted or adopted into the kingdom. That does not exclude the sign of the covenant, because in the millennial reign, we see how it is a requirement to go into the temple. So if you believe in Yeshua and you are now part of the commonwealth of Israel, citizenship, that's what the politia, that's what the word there means in Greek. Citizenship. In order for you to have a citizenship in the United States, you need a passport with a seal validating that you now have all the benefits of everything that a United States citizen should have. That's exactly what happens in the kingdom. In the kingdom of Israel, the passport will be the seal of the Holy Spirit. He's mine. But yet the sign of the covenant is what allows you to go into a higher level of holiness like the temple. It's really, really interesting when we understand it from this perspective, ladies and gentlemen. So now, to finish the teaching, I want to take you to the few verses that allows us to understand that the wall has always been there. Not only Exodus 19 talks about it, set limits around the mountain. The tabernacle had the same limits. The camp of Israel had the same limits. Anyone who transgressed the covenant was thrown outside the camp because the camp was holy. Now let's look into the Ezekiel chapters 43, verse 6 and 7, okay? Ezekiel chapters 43. I pray that you're enjoying this. It's a different type of take on it, but I pray that it's a blessing and that hopefully you'll get more clarity in this. In verse 6, it says this: while the men were standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me out of the temple. He said to me, mortal, this is the place of my throne, and the place for the soles of my feet, where I will reside among the people of Israel forever. The house of Israel shall no more be defiled, here we go again, defiled by my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whoring, by their corpses, and their kings of their death. When they place, watch this, when they place their threshold by my threshold, their doorpost beside my doorpost, pay attention now, with only a wall between me and them. they were defiling my holy name by their abominations that they committed. Okay, so what does that mean? Because if you read that verse, like I did for years, but once I understood the temple protocol, and I understood the first temple period during the time of Solomon, very important. In the time of Solomon, and you see this, by the way, in the time of the tabernacle, that Moses' tent was east. Aaron's tent was east of the door of the tabernacle. And the tribes were positioned around the tabernacle and the Levites around. So you have the tabernacles here, then the Levites were around the tabernacle, and then all the other tribes around the tabernacle in camps. Okay? And Aaron and Moses were east of the tabernacle. We see that in the Bible. But when you read these verses, unless you consider researching the time of Solomon, when he built the temple, he moved from the city of David, he moved on the Temple Mount, near the Ophel. So yeah, city of David, then you have the Ophel, then you have the Temple Mount, where the temple was. Elevation. Now, in the time of Solomon, he built the temple, so let me demonstrate it here. So this is the temple. We're looking to you. You are eastward. I am west right here. So this is the temple. Solomon's palace was immediately to the right of the temple, right here. This will be right. Okay? The city of David will be down here. Okay? So Solomon's palace will be right next to the temple, and the one thing dividing this palace and the temple was that wall, the Soreg. Because beyond that point, it was holier in elevation and holier in sanctity. So therefore, when the kings lived next to the temple and they committed all the abominations, idolatry, and everything they did, they defiled the mountain. And the temple will be defiled because of their sins. So that wall was the dividing wall of higher holiness. During the time of Second Temple period, Herod, he built the palace farther away, okay? But he built a royal stoa. So when you go back to the model that I see right here, you see the area. So you see where that arrow will be? That's the area where the palace of Solomon would have been in the First Temple period. And then the fence, the Soreg, would have been the dividing thing between Solomon's palace here and then the temple there. This is very important when you study the geography. Let's go to Maccabees. The book of Maccabees talks about this in the times of the conquest of the Greeks, chapters 9. Verse 54 says this: in the 153rd year, in the second month, Alcimus gave orders to tear down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. He tore down the work of the prophets. Okay, so this writing here is the equivalent of the Soreg. Also, Josephus talks about this. And Josephus was quoting the same thing in Maccabees 9:54. I'm quoting you from Joseph Good's book, Measure the Pattern, and he is quoting Josephus in this area. It says, in the above passage, Maccabees 5:54, the wall must have been the Soreg. The only other structure that could have been torn down were the buildings and the gates of the Azarah, which is the priestly courtyard. This did not occur until the building campaign of Herod, well after the time of the Greeks. The original Greek text of both passages, the word thie or thykos is used. This word is used hundreds of times in both the Septuagint and in the writings of Josephus. In these instances, the word thykos repeatedly refers to stone walls. Midot, the tractate Midot in the Mishnah states that the breaches were made in the Soreg rather than the destruction of the entire wall. So what we're talking about is, let me go back to this one. This was a stone wall like it is in the model. Let me go back to the model here. So when we go back into the temple, let me go right back in here. We go right to that door. Having the tools and the images helps a lot. to be able to see it for yourself as we walk in. So this big wall, 500 by 500. I come through here, and now I'm going to have the Soreg. The Soreg, it was made of stone. Okay? That was the protecting area that we talked about, found in the book of Exodus. Here we go. Made of stone. Okay? So the Greeks breached through it, and now you have the entries to go to it. Okay? Okay, let's continue. And it says, and the Midot states that breaches were made in the Soreg rather than the destruction of the entire wall. This further confirms that the wall was made of stone. For if the wall were wood, it would have been far simpler to demolish the entire fence rather than to make breaches. In addition, the Hasmonean would have replaced the wooden lattice fence rather than repair its breaches. Now, the breaches. Josephus records that the breaches in the wall of the Soreg were repaired by Jonathan, the brother of Yehudah the Maccabee. And we read, it says, we're reading from Antiquity of the Jews, okay? It says, and so having regulated these matters, both Shimon and Jonathan came to Jerusalem. Here Jonathan gathered all the people together in the temple and advised them to repair the walls of Jerusalem, to set up again the part of the wall round the temple which have been thrown down, to fortify the temple precinct by high towers. So we have all of the evidence that is here, and it tells us about this information, that it was not, that Ephesians chapters 2 is not talking about the Soreg, is talking about something different, okay? And let me give you one more description by Josephus. Josephus' description says this. Josephus gave 3 descriptions of the Soreg of the Second Temple. The following 2 quotes are the most detailed description of the Soreg. Quote, from Josephus, Jewish Antiquities, Book 15, 4:17. Such then was the first court, the outer court. Within it, not far distant, was a second one. The Hebrew is the Azarah or the Ezra Nashim, the court of the women. Accessible by a few steps and surrounded by a stone balustrade. In this case, the Soreg, because it was stone. There it is. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have all of the evidence to finally establish that what Ephesians chapters 2, verse 11 to 20 speaking about is not the Soreg that is dealing with levels of purity and sanctity. It's talking about destroying the separation between humanity and God, which was sin, the enmity, which was death, and also destroying the mindset of the religious world in the Greco-Roman world as well as in Israel, the 18 edicts of Shammai that would not allow the equity for Gentiles to be part of the kingdom unless they did certain things, and also, the Greco-Roman world not accepting the Jews because of circumcision. It's interesting that they will not accept the Jews because of the circumcision. To them, that represented sexual arousal, depravity, and all the things. And in the Torah, the circumcision was the sign of a covenantal relationship that would allow you access into a greater holiness, greater areas of holiness in the temple, as a sign of a covenant with the God of Israel. So I've covered a lot of area. I've given you a lot of information. Now it's up to you to go back, validate it, research it, study it. Be quick to accept, be quick to verify, and slow to reject. If we're not studying the temple, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to continue to use verses like this and take them out of context like people are doing in regards to Ephesians chapters 2, and the way I also did it a long time ago. And I am grateful that I found myself a teacher, Joseph Good, who guided me through all of this. He started showing me the evidence. I began to research it. I began to look into it. He didn't convince me. The evidence establishes the truth. So now I'm able to understand for my life some of the contextual verses in a more biblical, temple-related understanding. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't believe what I say, verify everything I say. Shalom to all of you. Bye-bye. And now we leave you with the Aaronic blessing. Adonai May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom.